Well, I see that we are now streaming live. And so for folks who are tuning in, welcome. We are so glad that you are here. We are going to be getting started here in just a few minutes. It's going to be a really wonderful and engaging afternoon. So, make sure you've got a good comfy seat, got a good cup of coffee or iced tea, whatever helps you be present. We know that we are going to do some good learning this afternoon. Welcome. Friends who are joining us, we are so glad you're here. Welcome to our Giving Day learning session. Before we get started, as we have more folks join us, want to offer just a reminder that today is the beginning of LSTC's Giving Day. There's lots of wonderful information about how you can participate on our website, through social media. Today's a really great day to name how the seminary community has impacted you and equipped you to serve the wider church and the world in wherever you find yourself. So today's a good day to be full of gratitude. We will get started here in just a minute. Friends, I am seeing if that is meaningful for you, live transcript of this is available. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can click on that little CC button that says live transcript. And then if you'd like to be able to engage that way, that is an option available for you. Welcome to our learning session. Well, friends, we would love to get started on time. And so wherever you are joining us today, welcome to our Giving Day learning session. On behalf of LSTC and the Alumni Board at LSTC, I want to welcome you to our 2021 LSTC Giving Day. Our learning session today is titled, "For Such a Time as This, Public Church Theology in Times of Pandemic." I will introduce myself. I am Reverend Liz Kocher, 2017 MDiv graduate at LSTC, and I am co-hosting today's event with Deacon Dr. Melissa James, MA class of 2004 at LSTC. And we consider it an honor to be hosting today's learning session event and to lift up the ministry of LSTC on this 4th annual Giving Day. So I begin with a word of gratitude today for all who have joined us on our Zoom and our Facebook Live. I offer a word of gratitude for the staff at LSTC who have been working so hard to make this learning session happen and make our Giving Day sessions happen. And I especially lift up a word of gratitude for our presenter today, Dr. Marvin Wickware, and for our 3 panelists, Reverend Priscilla Paris-Austin, Vance Blackfox, and Reverend Scott Fritz. These folks have given their time and talents to us today. Especially, we are thankful following our very busy and holy week. We are glad to be here today. This learning session is a continuing program involving LSTC staff, faculty, community members, and the LSTC Alumni Board. And it was born out of a desire to build an enriching learning experience for all folks connected to our community. The topic of today's learning session has been a natural emergence of the last few learning sessions we have had, as LSTC has always addressed the pressing issues of the day with a voice of compassion and justice. And we know that we have been called to such a time as this, as strange times as it might be with COVID. And so that we hope that this afternoon offers some reflection on how we as leaders in our church might faithfully respond to this time of pandemic and of reckoning with the presence of racism and white supremacy in our congregations and in our society. And so I want to offer a few notes before I formally introduce Dr. Wickware. We are going to have times both after Dr. Wickware's presentation and after our panelists present for questions. And so Zoom is real fancy today, and you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And we ask that you please do lift up your questions. Myself and Melissa will be monitoring these questions and lifting them up as best as we can. And we're going to have a lot of time today for some faithful dialogue. And so do lift up your questions. We will also be watching the questions on our Facebook Live. And so if you're joining with us on Facebook Live, lift up your questions there, and we will be able to bring those to our Zoom discussion. And then I just want to offer a reminder that today is the kickoff for LSTC's Giving Day. There are many, many ways you are able to support. There's some exciting programs in connection with the Giving Day. And so do check your emails, check our website, check social media. We would just love to hear from you on how LSTC has impacted you and your ministry. Melissa, did I forget anything? I think we're good. Well,
we're good. I put a link to our Giving Day campaign in the chat on Zoom, and you should be able to link it directly if you're on our Facebook Live event.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa. Well, I am just thrilled to get to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Marvin Wickware. Dr. Marvin Wickware joined the LSTC faculty in July of 2018. Wickware describes his research and writing as a way for him to work out the problems he has encountered while teaching and living in community with others. His experiences as a Black man working in the predominantly white institutions of Duke Divinity School and a Presbyterian Church USA congregation led to his dissertation topic of racial reconciliation in US churches. He is currently working on his first book, in which he demonstrates that Black and white US Christians must recognize that our world positions them as enemies, and explores the possibilities of love in light of that reality. His research draws on feminist theory and Black studies, and in his teaching, he works to connect an understanding of theoretical and theological perspectives to the church's engagement with pressing political and social issues, with particular attention to the roles played by emotion and affect. Wickware is a ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA, and his current involvement in community organization with the People's Lobby enriches his teaching and research. Dr. Wickware, welcome. Folks, as we are able to via Zoom, we'll give Dr. Wickware a round of applause. The floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Wickware.
Thank you, Liz. I don't think I will at any point get used to being introduced. It's a very strange thing. I need to be able to share my screen, our wonderful magic tech person, and then I'll really get started. There we go. Thank you so much. All right, I'll begin with a bit of context. First, in terms of the land that I'm on. I write, teach, and speak to you today from the lands of the Potawatomi, Miami, and Peoria peoples, from which they were forcibly removed. Their enduring claim on these lands and the thorough resistance to returning these lands to them in any meaningful way should reveal to us the extent to which white supremacy has remade the land itself in the image of white desire. And then a bit of context in terms of my body. I'm tired. I imagine lots of you are too. And I've got a kindergartner running around. So I'm wrestling with that as I speak to you today. There's a cat hopping up onto my lap intermittently. This is all happening right where I am. And I don't know how many of you know kindergartners, but the best way to make sure they're going to make themselves very present is to tell them, hey, I've got something important to do. Can you be quiet? So he'll be in and out. We'll get through it. So a little overview of what I'll talk about today. The bulk of my time will be spent kind of unpacking some revelations that have happened during COVID. To be clear, we didn't learn anything new during this, right? There have been centuries of dispossession and genocide, slavery and tyranny, resistance and creativity. These are old revelations that are being brought to us anew. Revelation is an ongoing, even repetitive process, right? If you think of God as a person, you have to kind of imagine, right, that God gets tired of trying to teach us the same lessons, right? In fact, I think God says so periodically in the Bible, right? So these are revelations, like many other revelations, that are repeat lessons, right? I'll talk a bit about the theological foundations of white supremacy as they've kind of been highlighted during the pandemic. I'll talk over some theological and liturgical alternatives to that theology, and then touch briefly on some political possibilities that have, again, been highlighted. Not necessarily, they aren't new, but they've come into clearer focus for many people during the pandemic. And then I'll have some closing thoughts. So white supremacy in the past year. I think 4 dimensions of white supremacy have really been made clear or stood out over the course of the pandemic. One is a basic fundamental disregard for life, accumulation as an organizing principle of life under white supremacy. There's a fundamental rejection of limits. That's part of white supremacy. And then the kind of looming ever-present possibility of white backlash. If you're not familiar with that term, anytime any kind of resistance is made or any progress is made in terms of civil rights or anti-racism or racial reconciliation or whatever you want to say, there's often a violent response from those who are invested in white supremacy called white backlash. There's a Nina Simone song, Backlash Blues, that captures this. So each of these dimensions of white supremacy reveals a dimension of the theology that justifies white supremacy. So I'll go through each of these and talk about kind of how they've stood out in the pandemic, and then say a little bit about what they reveal theologically. So first, disregard for life. Obviously, there's been widespread death during COVID, right? I should say widespread avoidable death, right? There was an active choice at many levels of government and commerce, in educational institutions, right? In hospitals, all of these levels, there were decisions that were made that caused hundreds of thousands of people to die who did not need to die because of this disease. And who knows however many other complications in society have been caused during this time. There's governmental neglect, right? That has been very clear, certainly during the pandemic, well before, if you want to think about drinking water, right? About the widespread dumping of toxic substances, particularly into neighborhoods populated by people of color. There's ongoing inattention to ecological collapse, right? It feels like at least every other week we're told that we've passed some tipping point, right? That now we're not going to be able to kind of take things back to where there actually was going to be ice in the future, in the ice caps. The Amazon rainforest is no longer actually a carbon sink, right? It's actually going to release more carbon into the atmosphere than it's going to be able to absorb, right? Every week or two, we discover that we're reaching one of these tipping points, and we look around the world, around the country, and we just see kind of a doubling down on the patterns of being that lead us to that kind of collapse. And to be clear, this isn't simply non-white and non-human life that's disregarded, right? Many of the deaths due to COVID, due to governmental neglect, right? And in the future, due to ecological collapse, to the extent that COVID isn't rather a symptom of ecological collapse. Many of these deaths were white people, right? If you look around the US, a lot of the worst places to be in terms of mortality for COVID are predominantly white communities. So this disregard for life isn't simply a disregard for non-white life, although that's kind of how it's grounded. But basically, if somehow a person thinks that white supremacy isn't their problem because they're white, right? They either have to be so invested in the sanctity of whiteness that they actually believe that they're safe. I mean, I get how it happens, but it's still that kind of intellectually I understand something, but it just seems impossible that it could be real. Or folks are deeply malformed by the kind of decades-long campaign of misinformation that we're kind of reaping the benefits of, so to speak. So the theological right, principle that's revealed here, the kind of theology that makes sense of and justifies white supremacy, is that creation is devalued, right? And the power that formed and sustained it, that formed and sustains creation, is necessarily devalued by white supremacy. So accumulation as an organizing principle, right? The kind of need to always be gathering more wealth, more land, more property, over against some perceived possible lack. Accumulation organizes our time. Folks working from home, folks being forced to work long hours, kids kind of find, I have a kindergartner whose schedule in life has just been uprooted like every few weeks as they figure out how they're going to try to do school this month. Talking about you in school, yes. And it's tough this year, isn't it? Yeah, it's been tough. All of these changes in how we organize our time, how we structure our days, our weeks, our months, our years at this point, all come down to the fact that profit needs to continue to flow, right? We can't shut down the economy because we are unwilling to entertain alternatives to a kind of profit accumulation-based system, right? We, not really being all of us, right? But accumulation is this organizing principle that structures our very, hours, minutes, days, weeks, months. Our health is organized in relation to accumulation, right? Healthcare in the United States is very much dependent on what is profitable, right? Profit kind of outlines the boundaries of what healthcare will be provided to any individual or community. Similarly, many people are forced to go work in settings that are actively dangerous for their health, especially during a pandemic. Profit accumulation determines, right, how far we can take our health seriously. Similarly, our relationships, right? Again, hanging out with a kindergartner who does not want to be staring at a screen doing school all day anyway. The strain on people's relationships, right, over this past year, again, isn't for no reason. It's not some mysterious, natural disaster that happened. It's a series of choices that were made to prioritize profit over people's relationships. A little bit quieter. And then people's identities themselves, right, are organized, again, by this need for profit. The idea that we should be loyal to certain employers. The idea that to be a good citizen, right, is to be a certain kind of worker. The idea that certain kind of relationships, right, are those we should be seeking out. I'm starting to ramble. But all of these different parts of our lives, right, end up being structured for the sake of profit for relatively few people. So the theology that's alive here, right, is that white supremacist desire is at the heart of discipleship, right? Who we are to be formed as people is shaped or is structured kind of and grounded primarily in this desire for accumulation. Again, accumulation for relatively few people. So third, there's a fundamental rejection of limits that's part of white supremacy, right? There's a rejection of moral limits. Again, hundreds of thousands of people dying, many of those deaths, right, disproportionately concentrated in communities of color. It's absolutely horrifying, and yet there are legislators, business owners, right, this entire class of folks and the many who support them politically and economically, who are invested in just pushing past any kind of moral outrage that might be rightly directed toward them. There's a rejection of emotional limits, right? As I said, I'm exhausted. I don't want to be working right now, right? I am here because my students need me to be here, because they have to be here. Why do they have to be here? because there is no stopping, right? There's no kind of saying, let's all take a year off from our careers so that we can be better. It's any kind of exhaustion, any kind of strain we're feeling, we have to negotiate with, right? We can't just simply accept that we need to rest. There's a kind of rejection of limits. That's part of white supremacy. There's a rejection of civil and political limits, right? If you look at the recent legislation in Georgia, that tells you everything you need to know. Or if you just look at how the US government functions in terms of legislation or its judicial functions. The idea that there are some kind of political norms, right, that should guide our life together is rejected by white supremacy and those who eagerly serve it. There's a rejection of biological limits. Just like our exhaustion is emotional, it's physical as well, and yet we are pushed to go well past those limits. And I should say, all of these, you know, the devaluing of life, right? The organizing life based on accumulation, rejecting limits. These are patterns that were formed, right, in the genocide and slavery that are at the basis of US American life. Laborers today are pushed past their limits because the kind of founding image of a US American laborer is an enslaved person, right, who is not allowed to have limits. This is why white supremacy ends up affecting everybody, no matter what their skin looks like, because the kind of erosion of these limits, right, doesn't stop with Black people or stop with Native folks, right? It expands to include everybody. And then there's the rejection of ecological limits that we are living in the middle of and continue to dive into. So the theology here, right, is the exaltation of individual human creatures, right, not just all humans, although some folks would like to believe they're included in the group, but the exaltation of individual human creatures above all creation. Certain individuals are basically put into a position that they can tell other people and kind of demand of all creation that any kind of limits be ignored for the sake of their well-being. Well, their idea of their well-being anyway. So lastly, white backlash. There's extra legal violence that's part of it, right? We've seen this for, you know, centuries, for decades certainly, and for the last few years, more people have been paying attention to it. The way in which private citizens, right, will take it into their hands to somehow get back at people of color who have somehow wronged them by existing, right, by challenging the kind of exalted status of whiteness. Then there's state violence, right? In Chicago, we got to enjoy our mayor, Lori Lightfoot, have consistently positioning the police and protesters in ways that would necessarily lead to violence being directed against those protesters, right? The police serve as kind of the legal side of white backlash, taking out violence against protesters. There's also legislation, right? Again, to point to Georgia and the voting legislation there. Progress is made, some kind of resistance is shown, and so legislation needs to become more restrictive in response, right? This is an old pattern. It's nothing new, again. So the theology here is that justice and vengeance belong not to the Lord, or rather belong to those who believe themselves to be the Lord, right? To angry white men, whether those are individual white men with guns, whether those are the police. And of course, not all police are white men, but I would say that the image of the police officer is very much one of white masculinity. I say this as the son of a police officer who's Black, right? That his wrestling, right, was always with this career that pushed him to live as if he were an angry white man, right? And to try to resist that. And if you look at legislators in the US and that you can find just over and over again these images of them just getting red in the face, screaming at people of color who dare to challenge their idea of how the country should be run. Justice and vengeance belong to angry white men under white supremacy. So this theology of white supremacy that lifts up some above others, right? That gives to them power over creation, power to define right and wrong, to level punishment to those who would challenge their might, right? This is idolatry, if that wasn't clear already. But its idolatry doesn't actually lift up all white people, right? It recruits white people into believing they're made in the image of wealthy white elites. This is the kind of political reality of the United States, right, and its current two-party system. This idolatry forms white folks into eagerly sacrificing their well-being and, of course, that of others for the sake of this idol. So what are some theological or liturgical alternatives? So against disregard for life, I think there's a needed reorientation of our perception of what life is. If we think of life in terms of resurrection, right? Resurrection is always accountable to the cross. So rather than life just kind of extending endlessly and to be taken for granted, right? We need to realize that life is only kind of bought and earned, in a sense, through suffering. That's not what we would like, absolutely, but as long as evil is in this world, right? Sweetie. The cat and the kid have a wonderful bond. If we think of life in terms of resurrection, right, then it's accountable to something. We can't just treat life as if it's free, right? We can't treat life as if it has no kind of, as if it's not grounded in anything other than our desires. I think we also have to think about baptism, right? I've learned in my time at a Lutheran seminary to really give baptism thought if I'm going to say anything theological.
Do you like Remy's scarf?
I'm doing my work right now. Okay.
Can I make you one?
I'll talk about Remy with you later.
Okay. Hello.
Baptism. Baptism is baptism into death, right? The kind of freedom that we enjoy over against death, to not be afraid of it, right? Is not because somehow death has no claim on us whatsoever, that we're untouchable in a sense, but rather that we can persist through death, right? That death cannot overcome us, that it can't end us. To act as though life is just something we can kind of take or leave, toss aside, is really to ignore what baptism means, right? So over against thinking of accumulation as this kind of organizing principle of life, I think there are two kind of mutually reinforcing alternatives. One is the Sabbath, right, as a way to organize our time, organize our relationships, to put rest at the center of our communities, especially that's hopefully more possible in our church communities. But even for our churches and our Christian communities to serve as spaces that can provide rest, right, beyond the walls of their communities, beyond the apparent boundaries of the church, to work to take rest seriously as something that's not optional, right, and not a luxury, but again, an organizing principle of our lives. Second, and I think these are necessarily related, care for the most vulnerable, right, is an alternative organizing principle for how we live in our communities. I don't think you can think about care for the most vulnerable without thinking about rest, right? you can end up in this unhealthy dynamic where you have people who think they're just like saving everybody else or something, as if they don't also need rest, as if they don't also need care. So I think any idea of care for the most vulnerable needs to be tempered by an appreciation for Sabbath. But if we want to take seriously resisting and unmaking white supremacy, we have to have some other way to organize our life, because white supremacy has pretty thoroughly done it for the last few centuries in this country and everywhere that colonialism has touched, right? So against that rejection of limits of all sorts, we need to embrace our limits as holy, right? So not simply caring for the most vulnerable, right? But cultivating spiritual practices that honor our vulnerability. And again, not just spiritual practices that we do kind of during church, right? But spiritual practices in that broader sense of discipleship and in terms of mission, right? In terms of what we carry out into our lives, so that when we're at work, when we're caring for children, when we're caring for our loved ones who have trouble caring for themselves, when we go out into the political realm, right? That we don't just see our limits as something to be lamented, right? But actually as something that are important, right? That creates space for others to actually exist in relationship with us, and that help us to recognize those real kind of creaturely limits within which we exist, right? That we can't actually fix everything, that we can't have our will whenever we would. Our kind of smaller, more tangibly felt limits teach us that lesson. So these are individual and communal limits, right? Individual and communal forms of vulnerability, and also economic limits and forms of vulnerability, relational forms of vulnerability, physical forms of vulnerability, and we need practices, right, that work on all of these levels. One in particular that I think is central to so many churches, but isn't taken seriously enough, is kind of cherishing limits kind of through testimony. Testimony can so often become kind of a way to talk about how amazing God is, how wonderful God is, because look at this amazing thing I've done. I think testimony is a really powerful space kind of within our liturgies, where we can talk about failure, right? Where we can talk about limits, where we can talk about vulnerability, and give those things the status of spaces where God is just as powerfully at work as in our triumphs, as in our victories, right? And I think over the last year, right, it's been much easier to find spaces of vulnerability and of weakness, of limits, than it is to kind of lean into victories. So last, white backlash. We have to recognize white supremacy as demonic, right? Not just mistaken or old-fashioned. It's not something you just kind of talk someone out of, right? It's not something that people grow out of. It's not something society grows out of. It's demonic. It is persistent, right? It will not let go without being crushed, right? And we can question whether or not we have the strength to crush it, or if God's going to give it to us, or whatever. But that's what white supremacy is, right? It's something that will continue to strike back anytime it is challenged. And we have to prepare spiritually, emotionally, strategically for the enemy's opposition, right? That again, we're not just kind of helping people to kind of get to well, they're good at heart, and if you just show them, enough love, then they'll get it. They'll come out of it. Love isn't always going to cut it, right? Talks aren't always going to cut it. Some folks are deeply shaped by white supremacy, and it's something more like exorcism, right? Than just kind of, again, good old-fashioned discipleship, right? That is required. And so if that's what you're, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to do the work of anti-racism, or I'm going to do the work of racial reconciliation, what you have to be prepared for, right, is for this demonic possession to lash out at you, for it not to relinquish its hold on somebody easily. And so that's true in our communities, right? It's true in our congregations, it's true in our families, right? All these different levels that you find yourself kind of encountering this opposition. And it doesn't have to mean, hey, you've got to be prepared for a fight, right? You've got to be prepared to cut all ties with people. That's something for you to discern in the context you're in. But it does mean that you need to be ready to see the worst people have to offer you, right? For people to disappoint you on levels that you would not have imagined, right? As they completely fail to recognize others, sacred worth, or even just any kind of basic relationship with them, right? This is what you have to be prepared for, and you have to be prepared for what you're going to do when you are confronted with what people have to show you, right? With the truth of that demonic reality. I'm always better at talking about all the terrible stuff that's going on in the world, and what it means for, I don't know, how terrible humanity is. But I thought I would at least try to offer some revelations of hope, right? And over the past year. And I think of those primarily in terms of political possibilities, right? So this is hope that you find in the midst of suffering, right? In the midst of structural evil. Again, nothing new. This has been happening for centuries, right? Wherever colonialism kind of, planted a flag, there was resistance, right? There was hope, there was creativity, there was the preservation of ways of life over centuries somehow, despite active attempts to destroy them. There was the preservation of wholeness and relationship in the midst of dispossession and the undermining, right, of languages, of familial bonds. So this hope is nothing new, but it's always new, right? Hope is always new, always coming to us as a surprise almost, because that demonic force that we're fighting, right, always has something new to show us. Some new way of co-opting even our best intentions. And this is hope in the wake of lost optimism, right? That some folks still are kind of all the way through the Trump presidency were clinging to that hope that they never should have had in the Obama presidency, right? And this is hope over against a relapse of optimism, as if because there's a Democrat in the White House, now things are going to be better, as if white supremacy wasn't actually the organizing principle of our first Black president's, administration. Optimism is always kind of trying to pull us back into complacency, to get us to believe that, oh, we're on the right track now. Things are getting better. When white supremacy is just kind of changing up its tactics, right? So some things that have at least given me hope that I think can offer hope to us more broadly. The protests last summer were bloody, right? And they didn't stop. They kept going again and again and again, somehow, right? It's not just somehow. There's work that goes into that, right? So I guess the hope really is that work is actually possible, right? That despite how severe white backlash can be, folks are still able to resist it, right? And I'm hopeful that as the weather lightens up, as being outside with each other is a little more possible. We'll see how the pandemic goes, right? But I'm hopeful that we'll see this kind of protest continuing. There's organizing toward legislation that's happened, again, despite folks being exhausted. You've got, work happening all across the country to defund, police departments, to defund jails, to remove police officers from schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In Illinois here, you've had a bail reform right, law that was passed to eliminate cash bail. There's actual decent legislation that's happening despite the kind of tentacles of white supremacy spreading across the country. And you've seen mutual aid, which the widespread existence of mutual aid is itself a condemnation of the failure of any kind of communal care, in terms of government in the U.S. But still, as people have struggled to find what they need to get by, communities have come together in an organized fashion, right, to take care of one another. And I think that's a real, that points to hope, right? I think each of these, the endurance of protest, right, the kind of long-term sustained strategic organization towards legislative change, and the kind of ongoing, everyday kind of mutual aid. All of these are signs of the work of the Spirit, right? Of the clear direction that our society pushes us towards, this kind of like vortex black hole of white supremacy. That there's something that makes it possible to overcome that pull. So some closing thoughts as I've kind of wandered theologically and politically through talking about white supremacy over the last year. James Cone, a beloved mentor to me, talked a lot about risks of faith. And this wasn't something I really learned to kind of focus in on until the last year. But risks of faith it's the idea that Cone talked about the importance of recognizing that God is a God of the oppressed, right? That if we want to find where God is at work, you need to go to oppressed folks. That's the only place you're going to find the kind of keys to the truth of God's work in the world. But even so, it's not as though because somebody's on the wrong side of systemic evil that they're magically infallible. We can't know that our work is perfectly faithful, right? We can't know that just because we're going against white supremacy in certain ways that we're necessarily right. But I think we can be pretty sure that just letting white supremacy fester, right, to preserve some kind of idea of family or church wholeness, it's not faithful, right? It's safe in ways. It can feel like it's what we're called to, right? That the bonds of family should be stronger than any kind of political differences. That it's important to maintain the integrity of the church, regardless of what kind of divisions there are within the body, right? That kind of reasoning it's white supremacy, right? It's the nice, friendly face of white supremacy, giving you all kinds of reasons to believe that you can negotiate with it, you can coexist with it, right? As long as you have family, right? As long as you keep your church together in the old building, you can tolerate white supremacy, right? We don't know that whatever alternative we're going to find to white supremacy as we work is going to be wonderful. We can't know that everything we do to dismantle white supremacy is going to be faithful. But I think if we sit and really examine what's going on when we back down from challenging white supremacy because we don't want to break relationships, I think we'll find that those relationships themselves have been structured by white supremacy to such an extent that if you were to remove white supremacy from them somehow, the relationships fall apart. That these aren't relationships that are kind of fundamentally grounded in God and the power of the Spirit, right? If challenging white supremacy is what's going to ruin a relationship, what is the kind of animating power that makes that relationship work? And I think you can take seriously the guide offered to you by Black, Indigenous, people of color leadership in navigating those risks of faith. Again, not a perfect guide, but better than trust into how white supremacy has shaped you, right? Seeking community, seeking particularly, right, community that is led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I think second, there's no faithful future for a church that seeks to preserve itself, right? There just isn't. Again, I just said this, but it can feel like that is everything. That is everything to one's call, is to preserve the community that with which you've been entrusted, right? But the problem is this theology of white supremacy that I've talked about. It's Christian theology, right? It's not some kind of outside ideas that have snuck in, right? These are ideas that were formed by deficient Christian theology, right? This is the theology of colonialism, where the cross and the flag of every European nation kind of came hand in hand to claim the world, right? You can't trust that because it's church, it's faithful at all. The church is where this comes from. The church is what sustains white supremacy over the centuries. It's always gone back to the church, right? And so we have to be willing to challenge our churches to the point that they might die, or there's no faithful future for us, right? And this, I'll say quickly, this is the joy of theological education right now, right? Is trying to prepare students for a first call, right? Or for their various ministries, where there's going to be pressure on them to preserve the community they've been entrusted with. But at the same time, to get them to realize that church is not, right, is not the entirety of their call. That the church as it is something that might need to pass away. And so I in particular, I think my colleagues too, are trying to prepare our students for a future that we hope exists and that we can't even yet imagine, right? So it's a fun time to be teaching at a seminary. So another thought as I wind down finally, one of those preachers who just keeps coming back for more. We have to meet people where they are, right? So I'm not saying, hey, go into your congregation and just tear people's hearts out, right? I'm not trying to say to do that. But you can't mistake a demonic possession for principled disagreement, right? You can't live and let live. You can't agree to disagree with white supremacy. You can't do that. That's not faithful, right? That's agreeing to disagree with the devil, right? That's agreeing to disagree with something that is fundamentally designed to displace God and replace God with a white man. You can't respect that, right? No matter where people got it from. Well, they're just loyal to their family. Their family has been corrupted by white supremacy, and this is a problem, and you need to figure out how you're going to deal with it. That's what you're called to do, right? Again, that looks all kinds of different ways depending on where folks are, but there's a saying for that, right? Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You can't cast judgment on somebody that they are beyond redemption. But if you're going to participate, right, in their discipleship, right, if you're going to participate in the work of the Spirit in their lives, if you're taking seriously, right, your baptismal vocation and taking seriously their baptism, right, you're going to have to be cagey. You're going to have to think about how you work to participate in God's uprooting of white supremacy from somebody's life or from a community's life, right? So the thought I want to leave you with is that white supremacy is defiling families, it's destroying communities, it is fatally poisoning our corner of creation, right? As much as the rest of the universe will continue, regardless of what happens on this planet. How can you respond where you are, right? And how can you respond with the people that you're called to serve? Inaction is not a faithful option, but I think there's real wisdom and integrity required, and prayerful discernment with community to figure out how you actually can respond meaningfully where you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wickware. I know that it can be exhausting to preach or teach to what feels like an empty screen, but please trust that many people are watching and engaging and nodding along and saying amen and chuckling and trust that people are with you here in this. We just so appreciate your words. Melissa, help me keep an eye. Do we have questions yet in the Q&A?
We do not yet, but we'll invite folks to either put questions in the Facebook comments or in the Q&A section. If you're on Zoom, you should be able to click on the Q&A button wherever it falls on your Zoom menus.
And I will offer a question to start, Dr. Wickware. I was just so struck by your point, the fundamental rejection of limits. And I was like, talking to me, like personally, like were we in conversation about this before? No, it was powerful. Many of us are serving congregations that are starting to want to get back to normal and fill the calendar, fill the building with normal. How do we help our folks embrace limits and embrace those limits as holy with this like heartstring desire to find normal again, which was quite busy?
I have the same answer to like every pastoral question anyone asks me, which is also grounded in my lack of experience as a pastor, right? But what I do have a little bit of experience with is community organizing. If you want people to organize themselves differently, you need to learn their stories and learn where their self-interest lies, right? If you present a way of being church to them as kind of an imposition on them that, oh no, you don't know what you need. Actually, I know what you need. Here you go. Of course, it's going to be a bitter struggle. And the only way you're going to pull that off is if people have like a really high sense of kind of pastoral authority and will accept you telling them what to do. And the reason this is always like such a disappointing answer is that it's fundamentally long-term work and not like a quick response. I think you have to know your people's stories and be able to couch what you're offering them in terms of what they need and desire, right? So it depends on what is motivating to them and what is, for example, why are they wanting to be together in the first place? Right? Like what's making them want to get back into the building? What need is that fulfilling, right? And what else might fulfill that need? It's clear that for some folks, they're just completely rejecting the idea that it's unsafe to get back together. But for lots of folks, they're saying there's something more important than safety, right? Like there's something they need that they're willing to risk their safety and others for. What else could meet that need? I think that's the place to start is really understanding where people are coming from and what motivates them already.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wickware.
Thank you for that. And again, we invite questions in the Q&A and on Facebook. And as we wait for some of those to come in, I would love to hear you reflect a little bit more on what you both modeled for us and what you named for us, which one of those many things is the way that white supremacy is Christian theology, and that to disentangle those two is both the work and really the challenge, right? So would love to hear you talk a little bit about the role of deconstructing, reconstructing, and applied theology in dismantling white supremacy from the perspective of faithful communities.
Sure. I think as far as deconstructing theology, right? This is, I think a lot of that has to do with storytelling, right? With being honest about the stories of our churches, right? Of how they came to be how they are, right? Where they came from, who was excluded, who was centered, who was embraced, and how that's shown up in, I think especially not so much necessarily talking about, kind of big, kind of constructive theological claims or something, but looking at liturgies, right? About why we say things the way we say them, why we sing the songs that we sing, right? Why we dress the ways we dress in our communities, right? Really looking at the stories that go along, or that lie behind, well, this is how we've always done it, right? But like actually investigating this, because in a lot of cases, what you find is that liturgies, like entire liturgies, have basically been constructed to preserve a certain kind of cultural way of being that is itself, right, necessarily exclusive of difference. And that's not to say that every single tradition folks have needs to just be done away with. And I guess this is where you kind of turn towards reconstruction, but rather that we need to be willing to put the things that we've cherished for decades or centuries in conversation with what other people have cherished, and be open to finding something new, right? Be open to the possibility that what we are isn't entirely limited by what our great-great-grandparents were, as much as we love and appreciate them and ground ourselves in their stories. But that there has to be something we're open to. This is, I often find myself just talking as like a baby version of my dissertation advisor, Willie Jennings. And so I'll encourage folks to read his commentary on Acts, where he will say things more eloquently that I will stumble through right now. So that's where I'll kind of like wrap that up, is be open to how the Spirit invites us to become something new. He talks about that in Acts.
Thank you very much for that. And I think at this point, we'll invite folks to continue. If you have questions, to put them in. We'll have a little bit more time after we hear from our panelists for questions and discussion. So we'll just invite those questions to continue. Feel free to put them in so you don't lose them, and we'll hold on to them for you, so that as we come into conversation with our panelists as well, we'll have questions from those who are watching.
So I get the joy of introducing our three panelists who will be sharing with us today. And again, we are just so full of gratitude for our panelists who are giving their time and talents to our learning session today. The first panelist who we will hear from is Reverend Priscilla Paris-Austin. She was LSTC class of 2011, and she is currently pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran Church, ELCA, in the South Lake Union neighborhood of Seattle. This is a congregation that takes seriously their calling to be a sanctuary that is open and affirming of all persons of every gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, ability, age, and status. Their commitment to being actively anti-racist has encouraged them to be the fiscal sponsor for the emerging #66th Synod Reparations Fund, of which Reverend Priscilla, aka Nakia, is a member of the founding board. She is passionate about youth and family ministry, serving on the leadership teams for the ELCA Youth Gathering, Servant Life, Community Life Curriculum, and the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, Discipling Cohorts Initiative, and the 2021 Extravaganza Worship Team. She enjoys being a writing consultant for Disrupt Worship Project, Spark House, Sundays and Seasons, and more. Her calling to allyship has her serving as a member of the strategic team for authentic diversity for the Northwest Washington Synod, the advisory team for the ELCA strategy towards authentic diversity, and other boards for diversity inclusion, both in her church and for her children's school. She lives in eternal thankfulness for the partnership of her spouse of 23 plus years and the gift of parenting 3 amazing children. Reverend Priscilla, we are glad that you are here. Our next panelist we will hear from is Vance Blackfox. Vance is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. and he is the director of Otherwise, a multi-site cultural immersion program for youth from across the country. An alumnus of Texas Lutheran University and the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, Vance has served the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America in multiple capacities, from taking a post as national president of the Lutheran Youth Organization during his TLU days, to later working for the women of the ELCA, Augsburg Fortress Publishers, California Lutheran University, ELCA Youth Gathering, and LSTC's Youth in Mission. At present, he is the Indigenous Theologian and Coordinating Team Manager for the ELCA's Theological Roundtable, as well as the creator and producer of the Marvin Wickware Jr. Theological Symposium hosted at LSTC. Vance has also served Indian country in a variety of ways throughout his life. He presently serves as Director of Communications at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, previously served as the Director of Communications for Native Americans in Philanthropy, and has held Executive Director positions at the Haskell Foundations and Oak Indian Mission. Vance has served as both President and Treasurer of the Board of Directors for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and previously served as Guest Curator of the Indian Museum at the University of Texas at San Antonio Institute of Texan Cultures. He is also presently the Indigenous Theologian for the Faith-Based Initiative for the City of San Antonio, where he currently resides. Welcome, Vance. We are so glad that you are here. And finally, our third panelist is Reverend Scott Fritz. Reverend Scott has served at Trinity Lutheran Church located in downtown Long Beach for almost 6 years. Prior to Trinity, Reverend Fritz served 10 years in a dual capacity as the Executive Director of North City Parish and as pastor of Chapel of Peace Lutheran Church in Inglewood. New City Parish is a coalition of 8 Lutheran congregations formed in the aftermath of the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles, and Chapel of Peace is one of its member congregations. Reverend Fritz's work in New City Parish and Chapel of Peace included organizing and fundraising for food pantries and community meal programs, developing and supporting educational and arts programs for youth, and enhancing multicultural training opportunities and internship programs in Los Angeles through NCP's Urban Training Center. Reverend Fritz created a micro-lending program that has helped to create and support small businesses in South Los Angeles and Compton, California. In addition, Reverend Fritz has participated in faith-rooted community organizing and faith-rooted advocacy work, including the New Sanctuary Movement, immigration reform, and workers' rights issues in Los Angeles and Long Beach. Originally from Eastern Pennsylvania, Reverend Fritz earned his Master's of Divinity from Vanderbilt Divinity School in Nashville before completing his Lutheran year requirements at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. It was in Chicago where he met his wife, Joy Logan Fritz, who was studying economics at the University of Chicago. Scott and Joy have been married for over 15 years, and they have 2 boys, Scotty, 12 years old, and Jonathan, 8 years old. Reverend Fritz, we are so glad that you are here. Thank you so much for joining us. And my goodness, we have some fantastic panelists here with us today. And so I will turn it over to Melissa to introduce the topics that our panelists will be discussing, and then we look forward to hearing from them.
Yes, fantastic indeed. Thank you all for being here. So we have asked each of our panelists to reflect on 2 questions and add whatever pieces of context that you would like to that. And then Dr. Wickware will help facilitate a conversation between the 3 of them and himself as well. And so the questions that we have asked them to answer, and we'll go in the order that you all were introduced, are: how do you see white supremacy impact your community or the communities you serve? And what has been your or your congregation's faithful response? And so we'll start with Pastor Priscilla.
Thank you for having us here for this conversation, for the opportunity to name the demons of white supremacy and to rebuke them in this world. As I was thinking about the question about what it is that where white supremacy shows up in our community, I'm struck by being a community that is in Seattle, on the land of Duwamish people, a people who will not be recognized by the federal government, but whose chief is the name of the city. The irony and idiocy and injustice around that is seeks deeply into the way in which we live around here. And in this really blue, progressive part of the country that prides itself in being so open-minded, and the location and home of the nuns, we find ourselves so enraptured by the characteristics of white supremacy, like quantity over quality versus like progress is bigger and more. We are located, our congregation is located in the neighborhood of the South Lake Union, where when I arrived, Amazon was the primary corporation business generator of activity and economic action in that area. And it was pushing out so many people in our neighborhood that born of our congregation was a ministry for poverty and homelessness and care of our people. And the neighborhood that I was called to does not look like the neighborhood in which I live presently. Lots of big, beautiful new buildings, and Amazon is leaving. Google is coming, and maybe everybody's going to be remote. And the small businesses that I cherished and got to know as I walked around the neighborhood are gone. New businesses are there and trying to figure out what to do. And it is a challenge in our community to try and wrestle with our own economic privilege and the realities of the people who live in our neighborhood or lived in our neighborhood and have been being pushed out. So our congregation responded some 40 years ago by forming a nonprofit that now presently serves as a shelter for up to 15 men who are in recovery from addiction, a food bank that distributes weekly, a community meal that happens monthly, and a hygiene center that is open 5 days a week. And I think that as I think about what else we do and what we've done, and the conversation that Dr. Wickware has raised, I am thinking about this past year and grateful that our congregation has been wrestling with how white supremacy shows up in our world, and how do we power hoard, and how are we defensive, and where are we afraid of open conflict, and that we've been having conversations about where does God call us, in particular around our building, because when COVID hit last year, there was no doubt for us as to the need for us to leave the building, because those who were most vulnerable were our clients at the hygiene center, our men in the shelter, and it was unjust, unfair for us, for our convenience of being church together, to insist upon entering into their homes despite wherever else we had been, and to make them at risk and put their health at risk. And so those are some of the things that we have been addressing and wrestling with. And as we move back to the building eventually in the coming months, I keep telling my people, we are in the process of forming a team to discern the possibility of considering the options around what it might look like at the time when we eventually possibly decide to come back to the building. And we are that far from that decision, because we really want to ground ourselves theologically in our values and do things that will be for the best of the whole community.
Thank you so much for that reflection. And so many of the themes of what Dr. Wickware talked about were so present in what you spoke of. So thank you. We'll invite Vance to go next.
Wado, thank you. Thank you very much. Osio Nigad, Galanchi Dawado. Hello, my friends. Hello, everybody. I am Galanchi. My English name is Vance Blackfox. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, as Liz mentioned earlier. I do reside in San Antonio, which is the land, the unceded territory and place of the Coatecan and Tonkawa peoples. I am not too far, I live downtown and not too far from the spot where the Coatecan people were created, the Blue Hole, the springs that feed, or that once really fed the San Antonio River that now people know as the Riverwalk. I live not too far. In fact, I very slowly jog by the Alamo, what is known as the Alamo today. First being created by Spanish missionaries as a church and a place to missionize Indian people, and then quickly become a fort, right? And so that's how we have now known the Alamo for 200 or over 300 years now. And so it was the building of and the situation of the Alamo that is the beginning of the city of San Antonio. And San Antonio being also, ironically, the patron saint of Indian people. And so that's a whole nother presentation that y'all can pay me for later. So, I think about the Alamo a lot, and I think about the indigenous peoples that were here and that are still here. And so we still have Coatecan people, descendants, folks who are culturally connected, those who are still learning how to be native again through reclamation and having to reclaim because the missions and the growth of the city did so well to shame them out of themselves. And then we also then have, 5,000 other native peoples who come from tribes from all across the United States, many who come here because they are part of the military community, since San Antonio is now known as Military City USA, which is also another presentation altogether. And so I just think about the Riverwalk and the Alamo and all that history and how it's actually, in some ways, an example of one of the examples of where colonialism and the colonial project started. We tend to think that it comes from the east and goes west, but it really came also from the south and moved east and north and west, starting with the missions here in San Antonio and then into New Mexico and California and all those other places. But there's a lot of history there as well around how the colonial project succeeded, was intended and succeeded for the purpose of maintaining the power of Spain over the other European powers at the time. So again, I say here, I love San Antonio. I love the vibrancy of the city and the progressiveness. Yes, in Texas, we are blue. The progressiveness of our peoples and our understanding of how to be in community with one another and also how to love one another in the city in ways that maybe other places don't. We still have our problems. We still have our racism, we still have our homelessness, we still have our poverty, we still have all those things. But I really enjoy the work that we're doing to combat that and continue to combat, as well as lifting up the diversity that's present here. My situation, though I live here and I'm engaged in the city in a variety of ways, my community isn't just here in San Antonio. I think many of you know that my community really is one that's all of Turtle Island, all of North America, as I care for and work for and advocate for indigenous peoples in particular, and all people of color and marginalized folks. But my work and my call is to Indian people. And as a two-spirit person, as a leader who has been lifted up by my elders and lifted up by those who have come before me, I am the son of Anita. I am the grandson of Sharon. I am the great-grandson of Oklahoma. I am the great-great-grandson of Bertha. I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Anna. And I'm the great-great-great-great-grandson of Anna, of Susie. And I could go on, and I should go on. Because as a person who comes from matrilineal culture, it's my responsibility to honor them in the work that Susie, Anna, Bertha, Oklahoma, Sharon, and Anita have nurtured me to be. Who have readied this place, all this place for me. to be about out in the world. And so my community is large, and I've gotten to live all across the United States in many ways and connect with and engage Indigenous peoples. And I've worked for organizations that have allowed me to do that. I've created organizations that's allowing me to do that. And I'm so thankful for that opportunity. Yet in my journey, whether that be just my regular old Indian self or as a theologian or a student, or a lay leader in this church we know as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in particular, but the Christian church in general, big C, I deal with white supremacy every moment of my life. Sometimes it's in my face and it's put upon me directly by other people, by the things they say or the things that they don't know. It's put upon me because by just my own thoughts, because of the internalized racist oppression that white supremacy forces upon me, that I still work to heal from. It's put upon me by myself because I am overstressed or I am anxiety stricken by what I don't know about myself and having to learn about me and my peoples, because of the elimination of my people and of our culture and of our language and of our spirituality and of our love for one another and our own understanding. And we have to also, in general, work on our reclamation of helping other Native people understand what our religion is. And each tribe arguably has a different religion. But those identities and the suppression, the oppression, the disappearance, the erasure is a constant. And so I put that on me to learn more, but then I think about, well, heck, why am I learning more? Well, white supremacy. And it's so ironic to me that we journey every day as Native peoples, working on that reclamation or living in it if we can, depending upon what our situation historically has been in our own communities and cultures, missionaries came, the church continued, right? The first 400 years of Europeans being here, mission meant either missionizing and making Christians of Indians or killing us. That's white supremacy. And that's not stopped. I was just speaking to a dear friend just moments ago about this topic. And I said, white supremacy, where there is white supremacy, there God ain't. So for us, it's more than just being demon. It's that the irony is that Christianity, which is bound up tightly in white supremacy, was brought to us, and yet there God ain't. The last 100 years or so, mission turned into service trip or service project to take things to the poor Indians, white supremacy. Not just the bringing of stuff, that was helpful to a point. Still paternalistic, still misguided, still ignorant, white supremacy. But the very fact that they also wanted to bring Jesus when they've been bringing Jesus to us for 500 years, misguided, ignorant, white supremacy. So all that has to shift. And I always talk about it to folks, and I posted about Vine this morning just because it was an opportune time. Somebody else had posted about it and I reshared it on my Facebook page, and Vine has a great quote about religion, between Native religion and Christian religion and the difference, and about giving versus sharing. Sharing implies a sense of community and responsibility to one another and a relationship. Giving doesn't necessarily imply or demand that. But just the very reminder, it was timely. It gave me courage, and I hate that. I hate that Vine has to give me courage to say the things that I want to say, which is white supremacy is all of us sitting here right now. And we have to combat not just white supremacy, but we have to combat the elements of it before we can start talking about it. We don't have the energy. I'm so thankful that that Dr. Wickware brought up Sabbath. We're just tired. So by the time we're tired, so having to combat the ailments and the issues that we're faced with because of white supremacy, we don't have always the energy to fight the root of the problem. But isn't that what the colonial project was meant to do, set that dynamic up? So ta-da, you win. The second thing I'll say that Vine gave me courage to say, I believe, is that the church continues in Big C, right? Most denominations and other folks, Catholic Church, oh, we want to do better. We want to be anti-racist. We want to be anti-oppressionist. We want to be folks who are bringing justice. Now we're talking about white supremacy and being anti-white supremacist and to combat that. But the hardest part about that, though any of those statements, is that you have to be completely non-white supremacist to be non-white supremacist. You have to give up everything about yourself as you who have participated and benefited from white supremacy has taken away from people of color, from other marginalized folks. You have to all that power that you took from us, you have to give up. Dr. Wickware laid it out nicely about how, why, and how that's supposed to happen. But to put that reality into play takes more than just one good-hearted white person to do. The church has to reform if we are to be a church of justice that does not play the game of white supremacy, that does not enter the system of white supremacy, that does not continue to kill people because of white supremacy. Today, as of today, just a little over a year from the first knowledge of COVID-19, on the Navajo reservation alone, 1,258 Navajo people dead from COVID-19. White supremacy. Our numbers, Navajo more than others, but our numbers across the board were times 5, times 16, times 18, the amount of people infected and or killed from COVID-19. And it wasn't just because we got the disease or that because we couldn't handle European diseases anymore. We've entered into that white supremacy. We know your diseases. We make the same coughs that you do now. We throw up the same vomit that you do now. COVID-19 killed us not because we couldn't handle it in the same way that you do now, but because we didn't have the hospital beds, because we didn't have running water, because we didn't have nutritious food for generations to combat the virus that was entering our bodies, white supremacy. So we're combating an ailment of white supremacy and not really able to think about how to combat white supremacy. That's where you all come in. That's where non-natives come in. That's where white people come in. If you are going to be a Christian who is centered in justice, that's what you have to do. You have to figure out how you use your power to give up your power. Are you willing? It's tough, but I'll trade you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking that truth into this place and for the courage and generosity with which you did that. And we'll hear from Pastor Scott.
I think that's a good segue as well. As white heterosexual male who is related to Henry Muhlenberg, of all people. So my roots run pretty deep within the Lutheran Church since my ancestors landed on Turtle Island back in 1701 from the New York colony and then into Pennsylvania. And one of my ancestors who lived amongst the Iroquois Confederacy and in the with the Mohawk people for a time, and was a translator between the English and British, even though he first language was German. But I do want to acknowledge where I am speaking from today. on the land of the Tongva people and the Chumash people here in Southern California. And you know, to be honored and humbled to be a part of this distinguished panel. And I see my role oftentimes, because of my privilege, to be a listener, to listen more than I speak, and to see. I think those are the things that we pick up from scriptures. We've just been doing a Bible study on Exodus, and we're most of the way through, but pointing out how God sees and hears the cries of an oppressed people, and that God always sides with the oppressed and the marginalized, and that somebody is always doing that towards people. And then our responsibility as people of conscience, as people of goodwill, is that we cannot sit on the sidelines. We cannot sit on the fence. We have to choose sides. God has chosen a side. We are called to choose a side. And so in my bio, I had my time working with New City Parish for 10 years, formed in the aftermath of the civil unrest in Los Angeles, following the not guilty verdict of police officers who beat Rodney King. And it was a wonderful place to be with a diverse group of people from all over the place who are trying to work for the common good and to try to be a sign of what the multicultural church could be and could imagine us being. After 10 years, I've felt kind of this calling to, and especially as a white pastor within multicultural congregations, prominently Black congregations, Latino congregations, to work with a single congregation in a multicultural setting. As Reverend Priscilla mentioned, you know, our quantity, not quality. So the congregation that I just resigned from as of yesterday, which is Trinity Lutheran in downtown Long Beach, would quantify as a multicultural church. It would not qualify as a multicultural church because power and leadership is not qualified. The power rests within, you know, those who are predominantly white, whereas, you know, those who are people of color oftentimes get pushed, you know, to the margins. And I think this is oftentimes more of the norm within our predominantly white denomination, where we have quantifiable multicultural congregations, but that are not qualifiable multicultural congregations, because that's the hard work that needs to take place, right? That's where listening to people's stories, understanding where people are coming from, and to choose a side. Are we going to be anti-racist, or are we going to perpetuate white supremacy? And so what I thought I'd do is share some of my experiences, and I'll do my best not to trash a congregation or reputations and other things, but I think it's part of the truth telling and the storytelling that we have to do. As mentioned, I met my spouse Joy in Chicago. Part of her background too, so you're aware of, you know, part of the story as well, is she's Belizean American, and has African, indigenous, multiracial, multi-ethnic roots, as well as our children as well. So the second Sunday that I was at my current congregation, during the middle of my sermon, and it's maybe 20 people within this large church that you can kind of see in my background, and an older white woman came in and just started yelling at my wife and children during the middle of my sermon for sitting in her pew. And the notion of, she might as well said, and I don't know if she did say, about kind of those bastard children and all the different stereotypes and other things that kind of come out when somebody sees a presumably single woman with children in a congregation, and a woman of color as well. And I think the deafening thing was the silence of kind of the white folks around it. as though it were kind of, in a sense, commonplace. And there was an African-American member who went over and notified the person who was a longtime member but didn't really show up all that often, when he reminded her that, or told her that that was the pastor's wife and children. And of course, her tune changed and those sorts of things. And she didn't come back for a very, very long time. But also, I think, too, for myself, because I'm definitely no hero, I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything. I was quiet. While a new member of the church and my own spouse and children were being berated by a woman who was expressing her white supremacy over that situation. And so I think there's plenty of stories that we can all share with of being on the receiving end of many of these situations. But just the number, and I've been there 6 years, the number of microaggressions that I've witnessed and tried to confront or call out or name, and from the pulpit to mention, the demonic forces of racism and all the different isms, but it's particularly as we as a nation, you know, continue to struggle with the dominance of white supremacy within our churches, within our communities of faith. And every time that I've mentioned these from the pulpit or in Bible studies or in other places, of course pastors being too political, as though there's the both sides of things, right? Or the whataboutisms that take place. Well, you're talking about, neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville, or Dylan Roof, one of ours as well, right? You're talking about, well, what about Black Lives Matter? It's like, yeah, I wholeheartedly support what they stand for. Well, how dare, isn't it the, no, it's not the same. And we need to choose our sides and choose our battles, and stand on the right side of history. And so I think it takes, perhaps some courage on some of our parts, but we also have to, those of us who are white pastors within the denomination that every time I bring up that we're the whitest denomination in America. Well, pastor, you're always bringing up race. You always see race. And to try to let people know, well, yeah, racism is embedded in the DNA of this nation. We kind of transplanted it here from Europe, and it continues to destroy us. Those demons continue to eat at us, and it's a legion that we're dealing with, right? That needs to be cast out, that needs to be called out, by all of us, but especially those of us who enjoy white privilege, and are calling to really speak out louder, and more consistently, and to continue to be on the right side of history. I think there was another question that we all were also asked of, as far as like what has been the faithful response of our congregations. I think as I've been sharing a bit, my congregation that I'm currently at now, with that disparity in power and other things, there's definitely so many different challenges. I think a lot of us long for real, genuine, authentic communities of people who are of like mind and want to make the world a better place for all of our children, right? And I think, having those places are wonderful, and that's what we need to move towards. I think it's more than just a reformation of our church. We need a death and resurrection of the church. A lot of the stuff that we have needs to die. It needs to be buried, so that there can be new life, as we gather together, after the resurrection, right? So how do we, in a sense, do that dismantling, of white supremacy. And if the churches are going to die, then let's let them die, and then let's bring together people who want that real, genuine, authentic community of people, the beloved community, like Dr. King called it. But how do we, build and sustain that? And with that, I'll just kind of leave it there.
Thank you so much, Pastor Scott. And I'll invite Dr. Wickwere back to join in the conversation, and would love to hear the ponderings you have for one another, or how you'd like to be in conversation with one another. There's been a couple questions that have come in, but would love to start with the four of you being able to connect and converse.
I'll just say really quickly, thank you all so much for sharing. You've made this a much better conversation than it would have been if it was me talking with myself. So thank you so much. I have one question that I have, but I'll invite y'all to possibly ignore it and just ask each other questions if you would like to. But just as a place to start, something that a connection I noticed, especially in Vance and Reverend Priscilla's talks, was the importance of sharing, right? And Vance kind of talked about it over against giving, and Reverend Priscilla talked about it in terms of sharing space, like sharing a building, sharing life. I'm wondering if y'all have any thoughts on how sharing and reform relate to each other, because sharing can be like such a friendly kind of sounding word, but I'm wondering about the kind of sharing that actually goes past sharing, right? That's transformative kind of sharing. So feel free to give thoughts on that, or if you just want to ask each other questions, go for it.
I'll let Pastor Priscilla go first there.
All right, Vance. Thank you. I was thinking, for us, I think for me, the sharing piece it's grounded theologically in an understanding that God as creator gave us all that we are and all that we have. And so there isn't anything that actually belongs to us. I am, I will confess that I am a participant in capitalism, and I will do everything that I can to make capitalism work for justice and for my people. But I rebuke it at every opportunity that I can, because it's one of those lies that tells us somehow we own stuff, we own land, we own people, we own each other, we own the work of our hands, and we don't. And if we can relinquish that belief, I think, and actually live like we believe what we claim, then sharing is not just it's not just reformative, it's transformative, it's informative, it is restorative, it is who we actually are, because we're existing together, we are partnering together, we are living together. You talked about limits earlier, about like recognizing our limits, and I don't look at it in terms of limits. I look at it as uniqueness, and it is our uniqueness that enriches us when we come together, right? It's yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Pastor. A couple things. One, Priscilla was my seminary partner. So when I came in, she was the person to receive me onto campus, she and her husband and family. And so I'm thankful for that. And Scott, you did what I hoped to have done while I was there. It only took you 1 year, and I was there 6 years to make it happen. I did not find a husband at the University of Chicago. So I'm a little jealous, but congratulations on your successful betrothal. I'm going to say Pastor Priscilla is calling. I believe it. I believe she is calling on her indigenous roots. She is calling on her screw DNA. She's calling on her indigenous roots, and pooled together the words that would have been my answer in part. And so thank you for that. What I would also say, though, in addition to that, is that firstly, I'm going to qualify that there are a lot of times I've already thought of something, and then I read more Vine Deloria, and he then says it too. And he wrote it around way before I was born. So it makes me a little angry, but that I have to cite someone for thoughts that I was having anyway. But I think that that really is kind of indicative of Native people really raising up Native people, Indigenous people raising up Indigenous people to have a worldview that is unique and distinctive, and is not heard. And we hear it all the time. And then when it's written down, if you happen to study Vine or someone like Vine, then, oh, dang it, he already wrote that, right? If you're in the mode that I'm in. But most of the time, people never read Vine, even Native people, right? And so, but they're still thinking everything he wrote. So not everything, and maybe not all people, but that is our worldview. That is the way we understand ourselves. So this sharing isn't about just, I thank you for this, Doctor, so maybe this is something I can write about in addition to what Vine wrote, all the 100 books that he wrote, is that the sharing isn't just about the distribution and the caregiving of the community, the survivance, and before survivance was a thing, the thrivance of our communities, our villages, our clans, our tribes, and our trade routes and our metropolises and all those things, right? Because that worldview existed in all those places, all across Turtle Island and in South America and in other places where Indigenous people are and were. But also it's just a way of being, right? And Vine explains that even in the quote today, again, because that's where the sharing for me language came up today, was the sense that we are not we are not the first. Human people are not the first. We were not created first. I feel like we were an afterthought. God got lazy and screwed up a little bit, right? Made us imperfect. Everything else is perfect, right? And then we come up, we're screwed up, and then we screw everything else up. But this notion that we have, you know, and where it comes from, and it's really problematic. And I just need to go back to my Hebrew, right, and go back to my Aramaic maybe to see what Jesus said about it, but to think about this word dominion. Because that's where the shift happens for us when we preach, right? We got to care for the things that are less than we are. We've got to take care of that which is weaker than we. We got to care for those things that we can shape and form, because that's the power that our brain that God has given us has allowed us to do. When in fact, if we were really the smartest, we'd be thinking about it that in the way in which Vine and many other Native people, including myself, believe it to be, that we are the least of all created. We are the created as well, and we're the least. And I say it all the time. Some of you folks have heard me say it. There's nothing in this world. I mean, there's nothing. There's no other non-human person in this world. And by non-human person, I mean animals and birds and water and rocks and trees and all the things, right? Even synthetic stuff that some people claim is not natural. It is. Not out of thin air. Right? In fact, air is also created. There's none of that is dependent upon us as human people to thrive, to exist. If we were to disappear, all of us today, which we might, it's all the other non-human people are going to keep going, and probably in a much better way than they were since our being here. Since that seventh day. And so the other half of that then is that we as human people are dependent upon every other non-human person for our own survival and our own pleasure and our own selfishness, our imperfectionism that God created in us. our mistakenness, right? Some will argue, oh no, God created us in his image, so we're perfect. Oh, okay, we'll have that indigenous Christian debate later. But my point is that we have to then really believe ourselves. If we're going to reform, that's where the reformation has to happen for ourselves as individuals and ourselves collectively, that we are less fortunate in our blessings and are dependent upon all those other non-human people. And if we can see those other beings as people, then that will help us in that shift toward reform. And then if that is the case, and we then are able truly to humble ourselves to that position, which Native people did for generations, Indigenous peoples did it around the world for generations, then we will better be able to understand ourselves, not just as the least or in a humble state, but rather able to understand ourselves as truly a part of something greater than ourselves. And that it's not being a part of God or the communion of saints. It is about being a part of that crazy little robin that shows up on my balcony and poops everywhere, right? I'm a part of that bird, and that my rail is for that purpose, because the song is a song that I am supposed to hear. And there's a message there. And that I maybe need to get off my leather couch and listen a little more closely.
And I think with sharing, oftentimes it'd be wonderful if we're talking about kind of a reciprocal sense of sharing. But I think in the context of, as we're talking about white supremacy and those sorts of things, how there hasn't been the sharing, there's been kind of the imposition of things from the dominant culture. While extracting from other cultures and appropriating and misappropriating culture. So the calling for all of us is how to create, I think, an authentic, reciprocal communities that can share with one another, the best of ideas. And it's going to be that messy democratic process. I mean, we're here in America, where everybody talks about democracy and freedom. Well, let's talk about real participatory democracy and real sense of freedom that allows, people to share their authentic and genuine selves with others in a way that's valued, which oftentimes means that those of us who are from, the dominant culture to take kind of the step back and allow people to, and there I'm using even the language of allowing or permitting people, right? So I caught myself there. But just to listen, to be intentional, even with our words. Right now I'm going back to school for a teaching credential because I figure, if I could work with kids, and I chose a school specifically that had a background and an emphasis on critical race theory as well. So how, to kind of improve, myself to continue to be part of the solution and not the problem. As the rest of us are going to have to look at ways of how we're going to be bivocational in the future anyway, which seems to be the reality that most of us are facing. So what are ways to incorporate that into, building communities that are vast and wide, so that we're talking about, schools, community organizing groups, advocacy groups, a whole network of people that can build authentic neighborhoods and communities that share and value one another as equals and as kind of co-creators within communities and neighborhoods. And I think that's where we kind of get at that real sense of sharing and not extracting from one another and not being commodities too, because all of us are commodities in one way or another, being bought and sold and traded, throughout.
I'd want to add that I think part of the whole piece is, you mentioned earlier also about how, you know, recognizing our limits makes space for making space for failure. And this lie of perfectionism, which is a lie of white supremacy, that we can be perfect, you know, there is no perfection except in Jesus, and that's, you know, that's our theology, but we don't. But yet we go around talking about purity culture, and, you know, what, you know, you can have the perfect body, you can have the perfect life, you can have the perfect wife, you can have the perfect spouse, you can whatever, you know, like, it's all a lie. And because we seek out, because we're afraid of failure. And I think, and this is where my my youth ministry stuff sort of comes in, and I lean into the gospel according to Meet the Robinsons, which is failure. Congratulations on failure. We're moving forward. You know, like, it is a gift when we fail. It is a blessing when we fail, because we get to learn something. We get to discover something new about ourselves and about our relationship with each other. And the church, I think, is afraid to fail. We are caught in these cycles of quantity over quality, over you know, what does your parochial report say? How much money did you bring in this year? You know, do you qualify for a PPP loan this year, or were you too successful? Were you not successful enough? Right? Like, I mean, it is it's all this aspiration for perfection, instead of aspiring to, as Luther said, sin boldly. Just do it, right? And fail. Because we claim a Savior who's going to pick us up and transform it into something new and beautiful.
There's a question that was raised a little bit earlier that I would like to expand and hear you all respond to as much as you'd like. But Richard Perry Jr. had posed, does the paradox of Saint Sinner contribute to white supremacy? And I would like to expand that a little bit because I've heard us talk about and around a number of kind of core Lutheran theological constructs and narratives, and would love you know, things like Saint and Sinner, Reformation, Imago Dei, you know, some of these core theological constructs. And so would love to hear you all ponder, perhaps it's a paradox, perhaps it's firmly in problematic, however, but what do those theological constructs and narratives do in relationship to white supremacy? And maybe I'll leave it there and let you interpret that however you want, but I'm happy to clarify what I'm asking if you'd like.
I'll just start by saying, you know, I could dig in, but deeper to all this, but I'll just say that white supremacy, man, it really screwed us. What I mean by that is native or indigenous peoples throughout the world were not sinners before Europeans came and told us that we were. And the way in which we understood our relationship with each other and the way we understood ourselves as sharing and being, right, didn't permit much room for of hurting other people, though it happened. Warring happened, certainly. It wasn't a utopia by any means, but the understanding of why we did what we did was based on a whole different set of philosophy and ideology that I won't get into. That's the part I can't dig into because once I start, then we're here for another 5 hours or 10 days. So what I would say to finish that thought is that for me, I, as a Native person, as an Indigenous person who comes from my culture, who understands my culture, understands my relationship with other people in my family, in my village, in my tribe, and with you, I get to say, and Dr. Perry and I think talked about this before, right? That I'm still not a sinner. If I get to rebuke white supremacy, I then get to also choose what it is that's helpful to me for my growth and my presence in it. And people freak out when I say, when you're not a sinner, but you're Christian. Yeah, but I'm not going to take that label. I might do things that are wrong, and I certainly can practice repentance, but I'm not going to take the shame and guilt and the separateness from my Creator that I did not ask for, because that's what sinning has been, how sin and sinning has been taught to me in this Christian dialogue, right? I am not separate from my Creator. I might do bad things, and my community might make me do things to repent or to change or to shift or to reform or to do all those things to be a better person in relationship with others. But I sometimes can't answer those questions about both and, or I can't answer those questions about sin or saint, because that has nothing to do with me. You know, so I do get a little bit of freedom. Now, not every Native person gets that freedom. Vance happens to have studied what Vance has happened to study, and Vance has happened to engage in the beliefs and theologies and ideologies of Native peoples at the same time through all that, and taught about them, right? And so I have a little bit of, I'm gifted with that because of my journey and my experience, and I would like to be able to have other Native people sit in that power as well. And that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a second. I think one of the things, as I was listening to the conversation and even the questions, and thinking about when John the Baptist announces, "Here comes the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world," how did we forget the social sin and emphasize so much on individualized sins that are essentially created by the dominant culture for people who don't want to acquiesce to the dominant culture, right? So we focus on all the individual sins, whether it's human sexuality, embedded in our constructions of human sexuality, or other decisions that people may be making. So whatever anybody wants to talk about, like Lil Nas X right now, or whatever it might be, rather than the sins of the world, which I think many of us can see as racism or heteronormativity or whatever it might be, that are really the things that divide us. And in calling it out, that's where we get that white lash, from folks, whether it's, calling out white supremacy and other aspects of the dominant culture. But, embedded in America's, the United States of America's DNA is kind of this individualized nature of everything. So that everything becomes kind of these individual sins rather than the social and collective, which when we look at the preaching of Jesus, he's dealing with a lot of the social and collective sins of sin of the community. And again, John the Baptist, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world, which we may define as the empire, right? So how do we critique the American empire and everything that's been brought in with it, right?
Yeah, Dr. Cheryl Perro, in her dissertation of liberation from empire and the Gospel of Mark, talks about exactly what you're talking about, Scott. And I think it is this this challenge of the understanding our identity as individuals and as a collective people, right? Like, I love the theology that Vance gives, and I've had a chance to hear him flesh it out a little bit more. And so I get it, and I'm not quite there yet, right? Like I dwell in the both and, right? I am both a BIPOC leader in this church and a white presenting leader in this church. And if I don't say that, there are many who are watching this stream who are going to be thinking, wow, they got it, you know. And Vance and I have had this conversation before. 3 white people up here to talk about, you know, about this with Dr. Wickware, where, you know, my origins as a from the Caribbean and probably from the Taino people, but again, stolen from me. My origins from Africa, don't know where from, stolen from me. And so I am both all of those things and a product of the Irish Catholic Polish neighborhood in which I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And that both and for me is an important part of how I form my identity. And so I lean into the sinner and saint because I think it helps me remain humble, but also to combat the lies of white supremacy that white supremacy will tell me about myself and my identity. And so, but yeah, I do think that it is very deeply entrenched in white supremacy, and there are things that we need to unpack around that.
Thank you. And we are at time. This has been incredible. I'm going to hand it back to Liz to round us out with our some gratitudes and last bits. But let me just start with my gratitude to the 4 of you for everything that you've brought to us today.
Yes, a tremendous thank you to all our presenters today who offered their insights, their time, their own vulnerable stories. It has been a gift to us today. And so thank you, Dr. Wickware. Thank you, Vance. Thank you, Pastor Priscilla, and thank you, Pastor Scott. We just so sincerely appreciate your time here today. And for those who are watching, who have joined us via Zoom, have joined us via Facebook Live, or if you are watching this later on today, or even later on this week, we are so glad that you took the time to learn a little bit more. We hope that this is a time that enriches your own ministry. I want to lift up just a few things that you can expect from the rest of our Giving Day festivities. Tonight at 6 p.m. We are going to hear from Vima Couvertier-Cruz, who will be offering an introduction to LSTC's Antiracism Transformation team. So that's at 6 p.m. tonight. And then at 8:30 a.m., my goodness, do you remember 8:30 a.m. classes? We will get a taste of seminary, the classes from Eric Kyle, who will be opening up his class, Liberatory Educational Ministries. So those are 2 opportunities to just get a little bit deeper taste of what's going on at LSTC. And of course, we welcome and appreciate your participation with our Giving Day. And Melissa did remind me to name that all of these times are in Central Time. Thank you very much. 6 p.m. Central Time tonight, 8:30 a.m. Central Time tomorrow morning. And so check out the LSTC website, social media for how you can participate in LSTC's Giving Day. And thank you so much for joining with us in today's learning session. Blessings to you, friends.